Namaste and welcome to Nepal Conversations. We're very pleased to present Series 4 of Nepal Conversations podcast on the theme of erasures. This series is presented jointly by International Research Project Heritage as Placemaking and Nepal Conversations. In this third episode of Erasure series, we are pleased to present our conversation with Dr. Prem Phyak.
I think the erasure of language has multiple implications. What is disastrous is the forgetting. So how the state can easily forget the names of the land or the historicity of the lands.
Dr. Prem Phyak is an assistant professor at the Department of English at the Chinese University of Hong Kong. His research interests include language policy, multilingualism, language ideology, Indigenous language education, and teacher education. He has co-authored a book titled Engage Language Policy and Practices, published by Routledge in 2017, and has also published articles in several journals. Namaste Premji, and welcome to Nepal Conversations and the series on Erasure, which is produced in collaboration with the research project Heritage as Placemaking. Premji, you have been actively working on the issue of language and education, and you've also written extensively on Indigenous education and multilingualism. How did you get started on this? How did you get interested on this issue?
Thank you, Umaji and Stephanie, for having me in this conversation. I think there are two things that I had to mention. The first, my interest in Indigenous education and multilingualism actually is based on my own personal story. I was born and grown up in multilingual community, speaking my Yaktung or Limbu as my mother tongue in my childhood. But as I continued my schooling and higher education, I never got opportunity to learn Indigenous language, Yaktung, and use it in public spaces as I moved on the so-called social ladder, right, in terms of my education and professionalism. So that's one thing. And as a teacher, I have also seen that, because I have taught in a school, so in Ilam. So, and I have seen how students who were not really given opportunity in school to use their first language, their mother tongue, were struggling to understand lessons and make sense of their experiences actually in schooling. So, and these two experiences actually help me shape my understanding about how language is important, how language is key in shaping the learning processes actually in school. So for me, it's really important to recognize the linguistic diversity that students have for effective education and effective schooling. So that's actually these two experiences, the experiences as someone who was born and grown up in the Indigenous community, and the experiences as teacher or teacher educator who has actually experienced and understood how students from different linguistic backgrounds are struggling in learning both language and academic content because of language barrier. So these experiences actually get me into this topic of language and education.
Thank you. Let's talk about the erasure of multilingualism and the role of state policies. What kind of erasure can you identify, and how do you see this taking place in Nepal?
I think the erasure of language has multiple implications. If you look at the whole history of language policies, state language policies in Nepal, before 1990s, there were explicit policies banning the use of indigenous languages in school spaces and in the public sphere in general. For example, indigenous languages or languages other than Nepali were not allowed to use in court, in government offices, right, in schools. So these kind of such an kind of oppressive language policy contribute to the erasure of multilingualism. But this erasure actually contributes to the erasure of epistemologies because languages are not used, multiple languages are not used in school. The knowledge that different language communities, such as indigenous communities, have constructed and that children bring into the school were not actually seen or were not visible in school spaces. So that leads to erasure of epistemologies and knowledge as well. And that also leads to the erasure of history and culture, right? Because in schools and textbooks, most textbook contents are more represent dominant histories, right, and dominant culture. But there are diversities of cultures and histories that are not actually part of textbook and pedagogies. So I mean, there are explicit ways, there are explicit policies banning the use of languages or banning multilingualism, but at the same time there are implicit ways of banning or erasing multilingualism as well. So we don't have explicit policies to erase multilingualism now after 1990s. There are spaces for the use of mother tongue in schools and public spaces. But again, there are very discursive ways, right? I mean, those discursive ways are basically through our discourses that are actually reproducing the past monolingual ideologies that Panchayat regime has created, are still seen in the ways of teaching, in the ways of talking, in the ways of valuing multilingualism. Erasure is multi-layer and multiplying.
Thank you so much. We've also been reading some of your papers, the papers that you have written, and you have argued that the efforts to create equitable indigenous language education should go beyond a language-centric perspective, and you emphasize the critical historical consciousness of indigenous communities. What do you mean by this? Can you explain to us why indigenous history is important, especially in the context such as Nepal?
For me, when we talk about equitable indigenous language education, we should really go beyond, focusing simply on language teaching, right? For example, developing dictionaries, developing grammar, and training teachers and teaching. I'm not saying that this is not important. This is important, but but this is very technocratic, right? This is just one aspect, but we really need to go beyond this perspective, which I call a language-centric perspective, and we need to really focus on indigenous consciousness, historical consciousness, and history, which basically involves how indigenous people or communities had very unique history, culture, place, and language. So basically, critical historical consciousness is all about understanding indigenous history, culture, and place, the historicity of the indigenous culture, language, culture, and place, because these things are actually erased in many ways, are discontinued, and the younger generations are not really familiar with or are not really exposed to these important aspects of indigenous communities. So I think as we teach, as we focus on language, it's really important to bring in those issues, like how indigenous histories were constructed, how they were erased, and how indigenous languages carry epistemological, right, and the political meanings, and how indigenous places basically are important for helping students understand their own identities and use their multiple epistemological knowledge, as well as multilingual capacities in the process of learning. So for me, it's really go beyond just language, right? Teaching language as a set of rules, a grammar, sounds. We really need to integrate, history, culture, place, and epistemologies in the process. So that's more about critical historical consciousness that I'm kind of focusing on in my research.
Yeah, exactly. And this is also very much related to the ongoing state restructuring and the way Nepali state is looking at indigenous history as well, and especially in relation to the naming of the far eastern province. What do you think about this? In what way the naming of the far eastern province have been handled, and especially in relation to the way it deals with indigenous history in that context?
Yeah, I think this is very interesting question, and this is politically contested issue. As you said, like it is all about indigenous history, or the history of the place, right, or history of the land, right? So I see that there is there are two arguments. So the one argument is that the state actually the state is putting forward is basically just because the majority of parliamentarian or the elected representative decided to have Kosi as a name, so that's legitimate. But there are ongoing, there has been like ongoing activism and the protests against the long oppressive history of erasure of the name of the land, for example, right? And the land is recognized as, for example, Limbuan or Kirat or Khambuan. So these are the names. I think these names are they represent that land, right? But what happened is basically it's just about forgetting the historicity of the land and how the land that is now Kosi was not Kosi, but it was the land that was preserved, that was actually protected, inhabited by the indigenous people, like mostly Kirats, like Rai, Limbu, Sunwar, Yaka. So for me, I think it's more like playing the more liberal political game, right? It's which is mostly decided based on majority and minority. But since it is more like indigenous history, there should be no question of majority and minority. But what should have been done is basically understand the history, right? And having like Kirat or Limbuan or Khambuan names are not ethnic names, actually. So these are the names that were actually constructed in the land, right? Before the nation state, Nepal as a nation state was actually constructed. Even the Prithvinarayan Saha, the Gorkhas, right? During that time, Gorkha rulers had recognized that land as a Limbuan or Kirat and Khambuan. So for me, it's just about what is disastrous is the forgetting. So how the state can easily forget the names of the land or the historicity of the lands.
Yeah, that is really interesting. But the question is also very practical. So, how and where can spaces for indigenous languages be created?
I think this is very interesting question, but there are I can see that there are three ways to very practical ways. So the one is, of course, we really need to uh, understand what evidence is actually, talk about. Basically, for example, in education, uh, there are significant bodies of knowledge in, for example, in education, in applied linguistics, in sociolinguistics, in psycholinguistics, even in neurolinguistics, for example, or they consistently show that having multiple languages in school are very important for enhancing learning, right? Learning of all children, not only not only for those who are from indigenous or ethnic minority communities, for example, right? So multilingualism is an asset. Multilingualism is a resource for all children. So they cognitively and neurolinguistically, educationally, so they are really important. So that the first thing for me is we really need to discuss, we really need to educate teachers in schools, educate about the fact that there are evidence, there are research findings that show that the use of multiple languages, indigenous languages, are important educationally, right? Also, they say that I think another way of creating space is, of course, community engagement, right? We really need to help community understand that the history, language, and culture are really important, and even identity is a really important aspect of building equitable societies, right? Uh, in school, for example, in communities, in larger political scenario as well. So, and third, and most importantly for me, is it's really important to uh, to to have more power, to give more power to schools and communities, which has not really happened in Nepal. So most policies are one size fit all kind of, right, policies, and I mean they don't really recognize how diversities, how schools are different, for example, how spaces, how different regions and how different provinces are different, particularly if we talk about the language policy beyond schools, right? So it's really important to, for the space, sorry, for the state, for local governments, for provincial government, federal governments, is to look at how each provinces or each school, each village, or each municipality or school different, right, linguistically. So it's we really need to work on how there is no one policy, but there must be multiple policies, right, that would work.
And in this context, what kind of role do you see the Nepali state has taken or needs to take to support towards this kind of multilingual education? Of course, multilingualism is stated as a fundamental right in the Constitution of Nepal, but as you mentioned, there are quite a lot of practical issues that needs to be considered as well. So, what should Nepali state do better in order to make this possible?
I think in terms of policy, as you have said, the constitution or the state is clear, right? At least, it is clear that, multilingualism should be part of education, mother tongue should be part of education. But what is not happening is the state has not really taken action, right, to put these constitutional provisions into practice. For example, we don't have university programs, right? Or we don't have any teacher education program to educate pre-service teachers or in-service teachers or to educate public about how multilingual education or how indigenous language education can be implemented in practice, or in very simple, in some simple terms. So, what does multilingual education look like, right? What does an indigenous language education look like? So we haven't, the state has not really put efforts towards the educating teachers, for example, or developing human resources that could actually seriously understand at the ideological and pedagogical level in the for the implementation of indigenous language education in practice. So for me, the state really has to invest resources and create programs to educate teachers, right? But of course, at beyond education as well. So maybe the state can more work with the communities and outside the school context as well. So there are a lot of examples of how community schooling could be really helpful in transmitting the indigenous knowledges or languages from one generation to another generation. So it's really important for the state to explore different ways and put the constitutional provision into practice.
And the language education is also within this context where English language has taken over such a huge importance in especially in education. And given that our education policy was influenced by, let's say, Wood report, which talked about English language, which has created this context where parents prefer their children to go to English medium school as well. What kind of difficulties or challenges and what role do you see for linguistic activism within this context?
Yeah, I think this is very critical question and very ideological as well, right? So for me, I think one way to address this issue actually is having or making all schools, right, private schools and public schools, accountable for implementing constitutional provisions and ensuring linguistic rights of all children, and recognizing, of course, linguistic diversity of the communities, right? But what is happening now is basically, the state has very divisive schooling policies, right? As you know, the private schools and public schools. I don't see that there is an issue among the communities and the parents, but the issue lies actually in the divisive state policies, where private schools are not really regulated for their, very, I should say, very unequal language policies, right? So they can just use English as a medium of instruction, right? But the mother tongue or indigenous or multilingual education policies kind of seem to be only for public schools, right? But which is again very which is unequal. Why should this be only for public schools, right? It should be for private schools as well. Just because of this divisive schooling and language policy practices, there is a ongoing or growing tendency for parents to send their kids to English medium schools because of of course, the social economic capital of English as a global language. So for me, the linguistic activism most often it focuses, or mother tongue activism focuses on mostly on on the use of mother tongues in public schools only. But it's really important to make private schools accountable to ensure or in ensuring the linguistic rights of all children.
The next question that we would like to ask you is, what role does the high out-migration in Nepal play in that context? You've just mentioned that there's a choice for parents to send their children to English medium schools in Nepal and to private schools too. But I mean, people want to future-proof the education of their children. So how can we get that right? And then also, how about yourself? You're now in a Cantonese speaking environment. How are you doing this?
I think this is a very interesting question. So again, I would say it's not the migration, or it's not the I mean it's not the migration, and it's not the desire of the parents to see their kids to go somewhere and explore the world. I think it's not the problem, right? I think the problem lies in the policies and the structures and the system we have. For example, I would say most often, like, we create and we produce and we promote the assumption that, or the discourse that, if you have English language proficiency, or if you have English language competence, then you will be able to explore the world, or you will have better future, you will be able to migrate in different countries, which is true, right? But which is very partial, right? Which is true, but it is partial. The point is, you should learn English, or you should learn any language, right? Any global language, or learning any languages, or being a multilingual is always better than being a monolingual. But the point is, how do you learn, right? How do you learn English, right? And how do you learn a good English, right? It's really, there are studies that have consistently shown that, if you use your mother tongue, or if you get opportunity to use mother tongue, right, you would be cognitively engaged, you would be socialize better, and you will learn English better. And most importantly, you don't have to lose the abilities of your mother tongue, right? Or you are not losing your mother tongue, and you will grow as a multilingual subject. And you will learn English, you will learn your mother tongue, and any other new languages without losing your mother tongue. So the misconception that we have created in our discourses, the misconception we have created in our field as well, particularly in the field of language education, is that, you should forget your mother tongue if you are learning new language, particularly English, right? But there are, as I said, the studies have consistently shown that you can learn any new language, or any languages, right, without losing your mother tongue, and that's more productive, and that's more beneficial advantage. There are advantages of being multilingual than being monolingual. So my point is, what is our goal? Are we producing monolingual English speakers, or are we producing multilingual English speakers, so who are, who can speak English, who can use English for academic purposes, or any other purposes, and we can use their mother tongue as well to be more connected with their communities, to understand their history, have more like in-group identity. So both aspects are equally important. So, but if you lose one aspect, right, which is not really good for any individual like me, right, or anyone in 21st century. So for me, I think there is a kind of misconception that in order to, if you are migrating from one place to another place, you have to lose your mother tongue. That's not true, I think, but which has been very dominant in our discourses, right? Regarding the future, I mean, how can we, create spaces, or how can we help younger generation to learn their heritage languages, our mother tongues in this, in the age of migration. There are a number of alternative ways outside the community school spaces. For example, technology, right? So there are different softwares. For example, Google Translate, it's not perfect, but still it helps. And actually, technology creates a number of opportunities for younger generations. So I have seen, like, students from different parts of the world are taking Nepali classes from Nepal, for example, virtually. So we can create virtual class. Someone from Nepal could teach virtual class, right? And the students can, from any part of the world, can join those classes. And they could use softwares like Google Translate or Duolingo, even Wordly. And there are different softwares that would help younger generation learn multiple languages, right? To respond to your question about how I'm surviving in Cantonese environment, right? I should say I don't understand any Cantonese, a little bit, right? But in Hong Kong, because of my profession, so I teach at university, so it's my university is bilingual, has bilingual policy, but I can my English is fine, at least, I can communicate with the people in English, so that's completely fine. And but yeah, I wish I could learn, right, Cantonese and talk with people in Cantonese. That would be wonderful, but really I haven't been able to.
Yeah, thank you, Premji. We've now come to the end of our conversation for today. But before we go, one last question in terms of like taking forward this issue of language in diaspora. What potential do you see for minority language development in the diaspora? What do you see any good examples, good practices that's going on in the diaspora that is quite encouraging in terms of minority language development?
Yeah, I think different countries have very different models of using minority languages, right, or promoting minority languages. For example, in the UK, so there are complementary schools, right? I'm not sure they still exist, but there are long histories of complementary schools, Saturday schools, right? Community schools, where kids are actually taught about their mother tongues, culture, and histories, right? And in the United States, for example, there are different models of minority languages. For example, again, community-based minority language classes. In indigenous contexts, in different for different indigenous languages, mostly the immersion programs, right? In diaspora, of course, there are challenges to integrate minority languages in public schools or in dominant public, in public spaces, right? Schools and other spaces, but mostly community schools are really transformative. So, for example, in Hong Kong, I'm actually planning to set up to begin a community-based Nepali language class, right? Where children of different ages come to attend classes, right, after their during the weekends or after school hours. So they would come and actually learn some Nepali language literacy, culture, and history. So more like, if it is not really possible to have, for different reasons, to create spaces for minority languages in or within the dominant spaces or mainstream spaces, And there are always spaces, for example, community schools or community classes, right? These spaces, alternative spaces can be created, right, to promote languages. And even the concept of family literacy is really important. And I have seen in Hong Kong, some families are actually helping their kids, by, giving literacy classes themselves. Like parents spend some hours to teach them Nepali, or their other languages, for example, and they bring some, like they download materials from internet. That they encourage them to watch Nepali movies. They listen to Nepali songs. So these are actually, technology provides a number of affordances, right? So resources that could be actually helpful for younger generations to actually keep their heritage language proficiency alive. But for me, if there are, like, we are really ideologically clear about the importance of languages, I think there are always spaces, and that would really help our kids to become more multilingual and really help them connect their past, their heritage, their land, their people. So yeah, I think there is no definite answer, but there are alternative ways to create spaces for minority languages in diaspora.
Thank you so much, Premji. Thank you so much for your time, and we really appreciated your insights into the world of linguistic erasures and also the challenges and opportunities for language education development. We really enjoyed talking to you. Thank you so much for your time.
Oh, thank you, Stephanie and Umaji. So yeah, it was really nice talking to you. And of course, there are so many things that I could not really answer. So, but yeah, it's just a beginning of conversation as well. Thank you.
Commissioned music for this podcast has been produced by Vayu Audio Studios. Composer, music arrangement, guitar, tungna, sound mix and master, Vayu. Madal Dime Damaha and percussion Kunal Singh. Bamboo flute Anish Maharjan. Recorder Jaco. Bass guitar BK. Cello Celso.